So, Adventures of Mana. Is it a Final Fantasy game? Is it a mana game? Great question. In fact, it's the most contentious game I'm covering as part of this series. This is my series called Rediscover Final Fantasy, where I intend to play every Final Fantasy game, and I mean every Final Fantasy game, including the spin-offs in order of their release. We're going to play the good games, the bad games, the ones I've played before, and the ones I haven't. And in this video, we're focusing on the first Final Fantasy spin-off, originally titled Final Fantasy Adventure, when it debuted on the Game Boy in 1991. This is an action RPG with all sorts of weapons, magic, and snowmen. It's about a giant tree that you never really get to see in full outside the opening, a holy sword, betrayal, and sacrifice. Surprisingly, this game manages to feature as much story and arguably more sweeping narrative than its predecessors Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy III. The secret to this may be that this was not only the first Final Fantasy game, but the first Square Enix game that Yoshinori Kitase was involved with. You know the man. His works include directing Final Fantasy VI, 7, 8, producing 10, 13, and the 7 remake series. He's the head of Creative Studio 1, essentially making him an executive VP. Yeah, he got his start here. I'll be focusing on the 2016 remake that was made in 3D, as that's the version I decided to play for this video. This was my first experience playing the game. Or was it? We'll get to that, and my relationship with the Mana series as well. Strange to say the least. I personally hated Secret of Mana, which, yes, I still think it was terrible, even for its time period. So, given that this game is in many ways a predecessor to Secret of Mana, I expected it to be terrible. So did I think it was terrible? Well, you'll have to continue watching to find out. So the game begins with you fighting against a giant tiger enemy inside what appears to be a coliseum. After you defeat it, the game explains that you're essentially a gladiator who is an indentured servant to the Dark Lord, expected to continue to fight monsters for his personal entertainment. Whoa. This game started off much darker than I expected. Adding to this dark tone, afterwards you confront your buddy, Will, who is dying and tells you in his final breath that he needs to escape, and you should seek out Sir Bogard, who's one of the few remaining Gemma Knights left to fend off the forces of Glaive. So how do you escape? Well, it's simple. Just run through the gate when it opens to let in a new monster. Yeah, that's literally what you do. And through the front gate nonetheless. The Dark Lord should be firing whoever heads his security team, if he even has one. Come to think of it, there aren't any soldiers of Glaive to be found at all in this game. This is what happens when you're a developer and you work with Game Boy hardware, especially in the early days when there was hardly any memory on the cartridges. You gotta just cut all the corners in the story, man. So, after you escape, you eavesdrop on the Dark Lord and his advisor Julius. During this exchange, you essentially learn that the Dark Lord wants to harness the power of the Mana Tree, and Julius informs him that there exists a girl whose power can lead him there. Then you get caught, so the Dark Lord punishes you by knocking you off the cliff, where he probably assumed your death. But alas, you're alive. Sucks to be kicked off a cliff, but it all worked out in the end. I mean, you're now free from indentured servitude, right? And this is where the game truly begins. So you'll immediately notice the screen shifting constantly as you traverse the world. Yeah, this game is very much inspired by old school Zelda. Then, when you go into dungeons, you'll definitely see the resemblance here as well. They even have lots of locked doors that require you to get keys to open, kind of like the skeleton keys from Zelda. Except there's a problem with their implementation of that, which we'll get to later. Most of the exploration reminds me a lot of Link's Awakening, which shouldn't be surprising given it's a Game Boy game. The one thing that I absolutely hated about Link's Awakening, though, was this idea that you had to swing your sword aimlessly at walls, hoping to hear a different sound, which indicates that you need to bomb that part of the wall to reveal a hidden passage. Never again will I do that shit. Fuck that shit. I love the toy-like aesthetic of the Link's Awakening remake, but I'm not doing that shit ever again. So hopefully there's none of that in this game. Oh god. No. No! Oh, okay. I guess this isn't so bad. They at least show you cracks in the wall, so you don't have to go around aimlessly swinging your sword at walls like a lunatic. So you start exploring, and you bump into a maiden named Fuji. Or well, you actually get to name her at the beginning, but I kept her name. And she acts as your first ally member, which is something this game has throughout a significant portion of it. You only ever have one guest character at a time, and they each have a particular ability, and you can command them with a button. Now, watching this footage, you might think to yourself, wow, these ally characters have absolutely terrible AI. And you'd be correct. Like, they're just running around here like, fuck, I think I'll go this way, or maybe that way. However, their AI never really impacts the gameplay experience. They honestly don't matter much in terms of their real-time performance. The reason they matter is for their ability, which you can command them to do yourself. Fuji's is particularly useful, as it heals you, which really saves you on the item and MP usage. Most of the combat comes down to your control. And speaking of control, how does this game control? Well, in order to explain that, I need to talk about which platform I chose to play the game on. So before I started the game, I thought almost for sure that the game was available on PlayStation 4 or even Switch. All of the other Mana remakes are available on those platforms, but this one isn't. It is available on PlayStation Vita, so that's likely what I was thinking of. However, I don't own a Vita, and I'm not about to buy one for a single game. So the only other option is mobile, and specifically Android, because that's the OS I have on my phone. So, did I play the game with touch controls?
God, no.
I connected my DualShock 4 controller via Bluetooth to my phone and used that to play the game instead. And I have to say, getting it to work was a very simple process. All I had to do was connect it from the settings app, and when I went into the game, it accepted it right away and worked fine. I didn't have to change any button configurations or anything like that. However, is the game's interface optimally designed for gamepads? Well, not exactly. The interface was clunky. You see these shortcuts up here? Yeah, it took me longer than it should have to figure out how to use them. When you go into the menu, you have to select the category of thing you want to place in the shortcuts menu. For example, item. Then, once you're in the item menu, in order to use the shortcuts, you have to hold down the L and R buttons, then use the D-pad to move the cursor here on the left. Then confirm your selection by pressing X. Then you're free to select which item you want to use on the right, so you move the cursor there and press X, and then it maps it to the shortcut. Yeah, it's a bit more convoluted than it should be. I don't know if the Vita version is like this, but it's not great. And for the record, you really need to be taking advantage of this feature, as you're going to need to constantly swap between various weapons, spells, and items all the time in this game. In fact, even when I have a particular combination of things mapped, I found myself still frequently going back to the menu to change the setup because the game forces you to use almost every type of weapon and magic spell at many different points, even throughout the same dungeon. So that brings me to the next topic, which is that I found myself surprisingly enjoying this game more than I thought I would. Each of the 5 weapon types are useful in their own unique way. The sword is clearly the best option for fighting, axes can be used to chop down trees, sickles can cut vegetation, spears are... okay, that one's mostly useless. And flails can be used like a hookshot to logs scattered across the world. Hey, I remember that being used in another game. What was that game? Oh yeah, it was Sword of Mana on the Game Boy Advance. Then I did some research and found out that Sword of Mana is actually a remake of this game. I literally didn't know that. So when I said this was my first time playing this game, I lied, except I kinda didn't. I then watched someone play the beginning of Sword of Mana on YouTube and discovered that, sure, it's a remake of this game, but boy is it different. Sword of Mana is more like a reimagining of the original, much like Final Fantasy VII Remake is to Final Fantasy VII. Like, it's a pretty different experience, so whether I played this game before or not is somewhat subjective, I guess. I also never beat Sword of Mana, Yeah, I have a weird relationship with the Mana series. Like, I've played almost all of them at some time or another, but the only game in the series I beat was Children of Mana on the DS. Well, until now, because I finished Adventures of Mana. So now I've beaten 2. But then again, is this even a true Mana game? Anyway, I felt that the way the dungeons were designed kept me on my toes, having to use this weapon for that thing, or use this spell for another thing. It feels like most of the abilities in your arsenal have a purpose to them, similar to a Zelda game, and I can't complain too much about having to reconfigure my shortcuts often, as the original game had to require it far more. I mean, there's no way they could offer shortcuts on an original Game Boy, as it only had 2 face buttons and no shoulder buttons. And some of the magic spells are fun to use. I was surprised to see that the fire spell has an automatic homing capability. Was it like that in the original Game Boy version? And the blizzard spell allows you to control the path of an icicle and then freeze an enemy into a snowman. You can turn monsters into snowmen? 10 out of 10 game right here. However, it's actually used as a puzzle mechanic as well. Sometimes the game will require you turn enemies into snowmen and then push the snowmen onto various switches to unlock doors. But unlocking doors, this is something that almost caused me to have to start a new file all over again after playing for 8 hours. Thankfully, I didn't need to do that, but it almost happened. You see, some doors require you have these key rings in order to open them. Now, normally you can buy them from a shop, so if you run out of key rings, you would just have to exit the dungeon, go back to town, and purchase them again. But I ran into a section of the game where I was locked into a dungeon and could not exit to go to any towns. And I ran out of key rings, so I couldn't progress. Now, what seems weird at times is even in the final dungeons of the game, you'll encounter enemies from early on in the game, like skeletons for example. At first, it seemed like this was a weird decision, until you realize that they are the enemies that have a chance to drop these key rings. I'm pretty sure that's why they placed them there, just in case the player runs out of key rings. However, the section I was at didn't seem to spawn any of these skeletons, so I felt I was shit out of luck. I continued to explore, however, and eventually I uncovered a shop that I hadn't found before where I could buy them. Oh, thank God. Between skeletons and these shops, I imagine that the developers have spent the time to make sure that there's always some way to get a hold of these key rings. But if you plan on playing this game, my pro tip is always keep a second save, or at least multiple saves for that matter, just in case you can't progress because you lack the necessary key rings to open doors. And when you get to the end of the dungeon, like many games, you'll often encounter a boss fight. And I have to be honest, once you discover how cheap the sword's special moves are, these fights are pathetically easy.
Fatality.
So you see, there's another mechanic this game has, which is that there's this bar that fills up at the bottom of the screen over time. Almost kind of like an ATB meter. Once it's filled, your standard attack will be much more powerful. And the sword has 2, depending upon whether you're pressing a direction while attacking or standing idle. If you stand idle, you'll perform this really long-lasting spin attack that not only hits a bajillion times, but can also prevent you from getting staggered from certain attacks. And if you hold a direction while attacking, you'll perform this flying charge attack, which does a crazy amount of damage. All you have to do is wait until your bar is filled, and then unleash either of these 2 attacks, and you will practically kill the boss in a few hits. So there's still a question we haven't answered. Is Adventures of Mana truly a Final Fantasy game? Well, yes. Sorta. So you might be wondering why I covered this game and not the 3 Final Fantasy Legends games on the Game Boy. And that comes down to the titles. You see, in the original country these games were made, which is Japan, the Final Fantasy Legends games were just called Saga, Saga 2, and Saga 3, each with their own respective subtitles to go along with it. There was no mention of them being connected to Final Fantasy in any way. In the West, however, when Adventures of Mana, which is a newly appointed title to this game as of the 2016 release by the way, was originally released in Japan in 1991, it was called and Final Fantasy Adventure in the West. So let's break this down. Seiken means holy sword. Densetsu means legend. So this game is called Legend of the Holy Sword. That's in essence what later became known as Mana here in the West, which, if you ask me, Mana is probably a better title for a video game series and has more potential for variety than The Legend of the Holy Sword. The Legend of the Holy Sword implies that there has to be some kind of ultimate holy sword you get in every game, which maybe when they came up with this series in the beginning, they didn't think this idea would become extremely generic, but it kinda is. Whereas Mana has the potential to be more malleable if they decide to take the series in a different direction. But I digress. The second part of the title, Final Fantasy Gaiden, literally has Final Fantasy in the title. So even in Japan, this title was meant to be a Final Fantasy spin-off, and the word Gaiden literally means side story in Japanese. So yes, it is very much intended to be a side game or spin-off of Final Fantasy. So then, does it include anything Final Fantasy related? And yes, it does. Throughout the world, there are literally random NPCs that are white mages. There are enemies that are black mages. One of your allies looks like a red mage. What's weird is that when you level up, you get to pick one of 4 Final Fantasy jobs, which determines the stats you gain during that level up. This is weird because it's actually not like this in the original game. So this was added just for this version of the game. Sometimes enemies can inflict you with the Moogle status ailment, where your character just randomly gets turned into a Moogle and you can't do anything other than run around aimlessly until it wears off. And then the final nail in the coffin, yes, there are chocobos in this game with the accompanying Uematsu composition. Chocobos naturally help you traverse the world much faster, and also help you to avoid enemy encounters. But it's when you get to the second half of the game that something I wasn't expecting happened. You encounter a professor who engineers a mechanical suit for your chocobo, which allows him to jet ski across the sea. I thought Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was the first game to do this, but nope. Adventures of Mana beat that game to the punch 30 years prior. But the chocobo isn't just for gameplay purposes. Oh no, your chocobo also saves you later on in the story. Look, he even picks you up and carries you. After this moment, the game actually hit me a bit, and I felt real companionship to my chocobo more than maybe any other Final Fantasy game. It kinda worked. And this part is likely Hitase's contribution to the game. Hitase has said in the past that the reason he was brought onto the Final Fantasy V team was because people were very impressed with his work making the cutscene in this game where a chocobo sacrifices himself to save the hero. Now, what's weird is that never actually happened in the game. I've ruminated over this, and I think what he was referring to was a scene during the development of Adventures of Mana. In other words, the scene he was talking about never made it into the final version of the game, likely because they changed the game. But I would wager a very strong bet that this scene here is what the final version turned into that he was actually talking about. Either that or his words weren't translated correctly. I mean, the chocobo does save the hero here, but he doesn't sacrifice himself in order to do so. The chocobo never dies in the game, actually. So, how is the story overall in this game? Well, it's a Game Boy game. You can't expect much in the same way you can't expect much out of an NES game. But at first, I thought it was actually better than Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. It seemed like the dialogue was better written, and that the actual characters stood out more in this game. But then I got to the second half of the game, and it felt like they sort of just gave up. I think the first half of the game was modified for this version, and the second half was more true to the original game, but it's still relatively on par with the storytelling of the first 3 Final Fantasy games. I mean, the games feature a betrayal that I honestly wasn't expecting, and the main villain turned out to be the Dark Lord's subordinate. And speaking of the Dark Lord, his final moment in the game is pretty pathetic. Like, he literally doesn't say anything, and then you fight him, and then he just dies. It says nothing yet again. Like, they could have at least added some dialogue in this remake. Like, how about some lines of him recollecting that he knocked you off the cliff at the beginning of the game or something. So that was a bit of a downer. At the end, during your altercation with the main villain Julius, the mana tree is destroyed, so the heroine Fuji sacrifices herself to give birth to a new mana tree, which is a bit of a darker ending than I was expecting out of this game. So it started off darker than I expected, and also ended darker than I expected it to. So, surprisingly, unlike Secret of Mana, I actually didn't mind my time with this game. It was short but sweet, and for only about $7 on the Play Store, I actually think it was worth it. So, what's next for the series? Well, next, we're moving on to the next generation of hardware, the Super Nintendo, which means we're playing Final Fantasy IV next. So if you haven't already subscribed, you should probably do that so you don't miss it. And in the meantime, you should check out my Rediscover Final Fantasy III video right here.